So, let's dive into the huge controversy swirling around the film Dhurandhar. Is it a masterpiece of filmmaking, or is it a calculated piece of propaganda? Today, we're going to break down the arguments from a viral critique that makes a really compelling and honestly, pretty startling case.
Now, the interesting thing about this critique is where it starts. It doesn't actually begin with Dhurandhar at all. Instead, it pulls us into a thought experiment, asking us to imagine a completely fictional spy movie. And this imaginary film, called Bawandal, is the key to understanding the entire argument. Okay, so picture this plot. You've got an Indian spy. He's deep undercover in Pakistan, and he discovers a plan to attack an army convoy in Pulwama. He doesn't just send one warning, he sends 11 of them. And these aren't just getting lost in some inbox. They go straight up the chain to the Prime Minister himself. And what happens? The attack goes ahead. 40 soldiers lose their lives.
So, as you can imagine, the spy is just completely shattered. I mean, how could this possibly have happened with all those warnings? His boss gives him this really chilling answer, saying the biggest enemy of Indians is Indians themselves. The implication is clear. There's a traitor, high up in their own government, who let this happen.
And then comes the big, jaw-dropping twist of the movie. The spy uncovers an audio recording. On it, the fictional prime minister is supposedly heard saying that if the attack happens, he'll get a big advantage in the election. It's an absolutely staggering accusation that a leader would collude in the murder of his own soldiers, all for political gain.
Okay, so you're probably wondering, why did we just walk through this whole story about a fake movie called Bawandal? Well, because the source argues that this fictional story is a perfect mirror. It's a parable designed to be a framework for analyzing the real film Dhurandhar, claiming it uses the exact same playbook of mixing fact with fiction for a political agenda.
And that brings us right to the core thesis of the entire critique, which is summed up perfectly by this quote from Suzanne Sontag. The source's point is that, unlike a lot of clumsy, obvious propaganda, Dhurandhar is dangerous precisely because it's a slick, well-made, and gripping movie. It works, and that's what makes it so worrying.
So, how does the film allegedly pull this off? This is where we get into the real heart of the critique, the specific ways Dhurandhar is accused of intentionally blurring that line between what's real and what's made up. Well, to make the story feel authentic, to really ground it in a reality, the film apparently uses some very powerful tools. We're talking about using the actual 26/11 attack as a backdrop, splicing in real news clips, and even using real audio from terrorists. On top of that, it creates characters based on real people, like the gangster Rahman Dakait. All of this just works together to create this potent illusion that what you're watching is the truth.
Let's just take that character based on Rahman Dakait as an example. The source points out that in real life, Dakait was killed in a police encounter, an encounter that his own wife claimed was fake. But in the movie, that whole controversy is erased. Instead, a heroic Indian spy is inserted into the story, completely changing the narrative.
Then the critique kind of zooms out and argues that this isn't just about one event. It points to a whole history of intelligence failures that have happened under a lot of different governments. The source claims that from major attacks, from the Kandahar hijack all the way to Uri and Pulwama, there were intelligence warnings that for whatever reason weren't acted on properly. And this raises a pretty big question. Why does the film seem to focus the blame for this kind of failure so narrowly on just one administration?
All right, so the critique then shifts gears a little. It moves away from the big plot points and starts looking at the more subtle stuff, the coded language, and the very specific way violence is shown on screen.
And that brings us to this term you've probably heard before, dog whistling. Basically, it's a way of using language that seems totally normal to most people, but carries a hidden, often divisive message that's meant for a very specific in-group.
So where does the critique claim to see these dog whistles in Dhurandhar? Well, it points to a few things. For example, it says Pakistani characters shout religious slogans, but never patriotic ones. When a villain dies, you hear a Hindu chant, not a nationalistic cry like Jai Hind. And throughout, the dialogue is said to hammer home this us versus them mentality.
Now, beyond the messaging, the critique also takes aim at the film's violence. The argument here is that it's not just showing violence, it's performing what they call violence choreography. By making extreme bloodshed look cool and stylish, the film turns it into a spectacle, which, the source claims, has the effect of desensitizing us all to what real violence actually looks and feels like.
And all of this is building to the critique's final point, its conclusion. And it's less about this one movie and more about the bigger picture. It's a warning about the dangerous precedent this kind of filmmaking could be setting. To really hammer this point home, the source brings up a very heavy historical comparison, Leni Riefenstahl, who was Hitler's main filmmaker. After World War II, she defended her Nazi propaganda films with this famous line, basically saying, "Hey, I was just an artist. I was only focused on my craft, not the politics."
But the critique flat out rejects that defense, bringing up Suzanne Sontag again. Sontag's argument was that you simply cannot separate the art from the message. She believed that Riefenstahl's filmmaking, every single camera angle, every edit, was completely in sync with her propaganda mission. In that view, the art was the propaganda.
And that leads us to the source's final, and maybe its most powerful challenge. It completely flips the script and asks a very uncomfortable question. If this becomes the new normal for filmmaking, what happens when another director uses these exact same techniques to make a film about the current government after it's no longer in power?
And that's the thought the critique leaves us with. When art is turned into a political weapon, who's to say who it will be aimed at next? It's a pretty heavy question to think about.